For any of you that have seen the movie The Matrix, you may remember a quote from Agent Smith, who said, "Human beings are a disease, a cancer of this planet. You're a plague." But it doesn't have to be that way. We are also capable of great good in this world. And if we want to stay on this planet longer than the 100 years that Stephen Hawking has predicted we have left, we need to change the dynamic and change the way that we operate on this planet. One of the biggest impacts that we've had, particularly since the Industrial Revolution, is climate change. And for those of us here in Chamonix, we see this every day in terms of the receding of the glaciers that we see so dramatically in the Mer de Glace. At the same time, deforestation is one of the biggest drivers of emissions that cause climate change and has a huge impact on local communities and the environment. And the products that we buy every day, from agricultural products to the coltan in our cell phones, can have a huge impact on those environments as well. Local communities are often disadvantaged in this whole equation. The benefits and the values are often exported while costs are localized. In fact, a recent publication from a group called TrueCost estimates that none of the world's top region sectors would be profitable if we took these costs into account. So if you think about beef in Latin America, for example, or coal in China, if you took into account the impact that that has on water, on soil, on local communities, not one of them would be profitable in today's dynamic. We have to change that. Now, who is it then that is paying that cost? If it's not the companies and this is not on their balance sheets, where does this come from? It comes from all of us. We pay in terms of the cost of the impact of oil spills. We pay in terms of the response to increasing hurricanes. We also pay in terms of migration. In fact, in 2007, the worst drought in recorded history began in Syria. It lasted 3 years. And because of the impacts on the local environment, about 1.5 million people moved to the cities. So when the conflict began in Syria, it was suddenly compounded by the fact that you had additional problems in terms of resourcing agriculture. So that drove part of the migration that we saw from that conflict. So we've got to do something different. A few quotes might show us the way. Societal challenges are a core element in the search for competitive advantage. And we need better solutions to solve global challenges, and we put this at the core of our strategy. Now, these are not quotes coming from Environmental Defense Fund or any other environmental organization. They are, in fact, quotes from the 2016 survey of global CEOs. So there are companies waking up to the fact that if you change this dynamic, if instead of externalizing those costs, you take them into account from the beginning, we can start to change the whole dynamic of business. Most companies think about this kind of an impact as an afterthought. They start from addressing risk and compliance, they get more efficient, they grow, and ultimately they might decide, oh, I should probably give something back. I'll do some sort of corporate social responsibility effort. But we're starting to see companies start from the other end and say, I'm going to build into my core business value that I, as a company, am going to act in a more responsible manner. Unfortunately, the number of companies that do that is still quite limited. We need to push. We need to push more companies in a better direction to have a better impact on this planet. One way that's done is through certification. Now, I'm sure many of you in this room have purchased fair trade coffee or organic cocoa. And for those premium commodities, we're beginning to see a huge change. You can see a growing percentage of certification. The problem is you probably aren't buying certified soy or sugar. It's very difficult. Many of these products are built into things that you buy you don't even know have soy in them. It's hard to then seek out, I'm going to purchase something which is certified. At the same time, there's a huge growing middle-class population in countries like China and India. And that's a very good thing. But it means that the number of people on this planet demanding these commodities continues to grow and will continue to have an impact. So what we really need to do is scale this up. We need bigger levers. We need ways to push more effort in the right direction. And that can come in a number of different forms. In one example, the European Union has a policy called FLEGT. Now, never mind what that means. Essentially, it's trying to get illegal timber out of Europe. Now, illegal timber is one of the major causes of deforestation because a lot of the countries where this timber is produced lack the capacity to enforce their own laws. That drives deforestation, that timber comes into Europe, and we continue to be a part of the cycle ourselves. So Europe has put into place a strategy where they're trying to remove illegal timber from the supply chain. So if we think bigger, we think about the policy and trade levers that we can use, we can drive a change much faster than from an individual choice, although that choice is important. At the same time, we can also go to the source. These commodities are produced somewhere. If we go and look at the landscapes in which they're produced, we can also try to scale up the efforts towards sustainability. Picture a landscape, if you can, in any country in this world that produces some of our major commodities. You'll find a number of different uses and needs throughout that community. If you think about an agricultural producer or a company which is buying cocoa in Ghana, for example, their whole supply chain is currently at risk. They are literally looking at a future where they may not be able to supply cocoa because of the impact of climate change on these landscapes, because of the impact of the trade-offs with other uses in that landscape. So they really need to maintain their supply. And to do that, they need to be able to better negotiate and cooperate with others in that landscape. Governments are the same. They have a need to show progress and economic development to local communities, but to do that in a way that doesn't negatively impact those communities and their environment. Even a mining company, who you might think of as a negative actor in this landscape, often enters a place for a very long time, 20 to 100 years on average. And they need to maintain relationships with communities and the government. So they also need a way for better cooperation and coordination so that their efforts and their impacts don't have negative impacts and vice versa. So fundamentally, what we need to do is create mechanisms to scale up how we assess these landscapes and how we drive change. If you take a look at this example, we have two maps. B is a carbon density map. Essentially, the red areas are where you have really carbon-dense forests, healthy forests, native forests. On the A side, we're looking at land use. You can see where there are protected areas, indigenous communities, logging and fuel oil concessions. They all have different needs within this landscape. Now, by mapping these together, we can identify areas of threat. So where do we see an expansion of logging concessions into areas that need to be protected, that are important for biodiversity or for climate change and protecting those forests? So we need a means to measure and monitor this and to drive more cooperation amongst actors in that landscape so that this planning can be done in a way that drives better outcomes. And the challenge, in many cases, is a lack of capacity. These countries are struggling to maintain development, let alone be able to enforce this sort of a land use plan, or in many cases even come up with it. So again, companies can play a really important role. Now, this is a very small segment of companies who have made commitments, many of them to remove deforestation from their supply chains, others for other environmental or social commitments. But for them to make good on those commitments, they need to know where their products are coming from and what the impact is on those landscapes. So we need to provide them tools for doing so. This is just one example of a way of displaying data. Now imagine if we were to provide a framework that was able to measure and monitor a number of key sustainability indicators at scale. Deforestation, water quality and management, soil fertility, all these things which together help create a more resilient and sustainable landscape. If you map them on the outside here with unsustainable practices and outcomes in the middle, and sustainable ones at the outside, we want to see a particular landscape expanding over time and improving their efforts. So with tools like this and measurement opportunities that allow us to really assess what's happening at a large scale in these landscapes, we can start to drive change. But the best tool that you have is worthless unless you have a reason to use it. I can have 20 pairs of skis in my closet, but if I don't have a reason to go outside because there's no snow, I'm not going to use them. The same here. We need to drive incentives to actually move progress in these landscapes. So those incentives can come in a number of different forms. The first option is sourcing commitments. So those companies that we saw earlier have made commitments to say, I'm going to have a better impact. If we can link up landscapes that are demonstrating progress and addressing those issues with companies who are making those public commitments, we can drive the incentive. Those landscapes have an incentive to improve because it will help them with market access of their commodities, and the companies can make good on those commitments. Now, of course, consumer pressure is also really important there and has driven a lot of those commitments, so there is certainly a role for the individual. Another key way to drive incentives is to try to drive finance to places where we're seeing better outcomes. There's a range of actors who are quite relevant there, from multilateral development banks to development finance institutions, impact investors. They've all said, I'm going to try to do better things with my money. But they as well need a way to actually demonstrate what that impact is and try to drive finance to those places. Again, by sort of creating these mechanisms for assessing progress and then tying them to finance that perhaps, for example, offers either preferential or additional finance to landscapes demonstrating progress, we could start to change that whole dynamic. A third option is really looking at risk. Companies, as we mentioned earlier, have a risk of really impacting their supply chains, not being able to procure the commodities that they need. In the landscape themselves, they also have the risk of other actors impacting their own investments and activities. Again, if we can link these types of frameworks to assess what's happening in a landscape, to improving the ability to manage and mitigate risk, we can change the way that companies are able to price that risk. For many of them, if you remember back to the fact that no big region or sector would be profitable if they included these costs in their balance sheet, the interesting thing that we find is that if they actually address those things from the beginning, if they say, I'm going to ensure that I am managing this risk and addressing it, they can actually reduce their cost and turn something from a cost to a benefit. Those companies are finding that it builds their brand, that it helps, in fact, reduce the cost of reacting to impacts after the fact. So by building that into the beginning and in their comprehensive business value, they can actually drive better change and a better brand and increase their bottom line. So fundamentally, what we need to do is make it more cost-effective to act better. We need to make it costlier to have a negative impact. And by doing that, we can turn the whole dynamic on its head. I'm not talking about revolution. I'm not talking about upending the market system. I'm talking about using the power of those markets to drive the change that we want to see. Thank you.